It all began as a seemingly ordinary morning in the set of a live political roundtable. One of New York's most outspoken progressive voices, Assemblyman Zohran Mamdani, arrived with his usual calm yet confident demeanor, ready to discuss his latest legislative efforts around housing justice and rent stabilization. As he greeted the production crew and exchanged polite small talk backstage, the atmosphere was relaxed, bordering on routine. The panelists took their seats, cameras rolled into position, and everything pointed to a smooth conversation ahead. The host opened with a measured introduction, noting Mamdani's rising national profile and bold stance on economic inequality. The audience applauded enthusiastically as Zohran walked onto the set, flashing a modest smile, the kind that conveyed sincerity rather than showmanship. He settled into his seat with the quiet ease of someone used to defending big ideas under bright studio lights. The first few questions came gently. One co-host asked, "Zohran, you've been at the forefront of the tenant rights movement in Queens. What's been the most challenging part of pushing for rent control reforms?" A flicker of passion lit up in Zohran's eyes. He launched into a thoughtful explanation of the political resistance he's faced, the long nights spent organizing with tenant unions, and the uphill battle against entrenched corporate interests. His tone was animated but composed as he recounted tense committee hearings, grassroots victories, and the broader vision of housing as a human right. The audience listened attentively, nodding and applauding at key points. Another panelist leaned in. "You seem to have built a real coalition on the ground. Is that solidarity translating into movement within the legislature?" Zohran nodded firmly. "It has to. When you're fighting on behalf of working people who've been ignored for decades, every conversation, every amendment, every vote counts. There's no room for performative politics when the stakes are this high." For nearly 10 minutes, the conversation flowed smoothly, earnest, energetic, and filled with substance. From the outside, it looked like any other successful policy-focused appearance. But seated across from Zohran, Mehdi Hasan had yet to speak. His expression was unreadable. Arms folded, eyes locked with laser focus on Mamdani. He hadn't cracked a smile or offered a follow-up. It was clear he was waiting, calculating, preparing. And then, without warning, it came. As Zohran was in mid-sentence describing a recent tenant rally in Jackson Heights, Mehdi leaned forward. The energy in the room shifted instantly, tension like static in the air. "Zohran," he said, his voice sharp and unblinking, "while we appreciate your advocacy work, I think it's only responsible to raise something many in our audience are concerned about. You've been an outspoken supporter of Palestinian rights, including calling Israel an apartheid state. Some critics claim your rhetoric has blurred the line between advocacy and extremism, fueling division, even anti-Semitism. How do you respond to that?" A hush fell over the studio. Co-hosts exchanged startled glances. One shifted awkwardly in her seat. The air had gone cold. The change in Zohran's posture was immediate. The easy warmth drained from his face. He sat upright, shoulders squared, jaw firm. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. He knew this moment was coming, and he was ready. When Zohran spoke, his voice was calm, but each word was laced with tension. There was discipline in his tone, but also a simmering frustration beneath the surface. "Mehdi," he began evenly, "I'm here to talk about the housing crisis and the policy work my colleagues and I have spent months building. I believe every person has the right to speak out for justice without being mischaracterized on national television. I don't think it's appropriate to weaponize political labels in a space that was meant for public discourse." Mehdi didn't flinch. If anything, he leaned in closer, voice sharpening. "Zohran, you can't expect to sidestep this. The viewers deserve clarity. You've publicly supported movements that have been criticized for inflammatory rhetoric and associations with groups that some believe promote division, sometimes even hate. Don't you think you bear some responsibility for the consequences of that alignment?" Zohran inhaled slowly, his gaze narrowed. His reply was deliberate, each syllable weighed carefully, but his clenched jaw betrayed the impact of the accusation. "Mehdi," he said, holding his gaze, "you're flattening a complex issue into a caricature. It's deeply unfair to take isolated incidents or bad faith interpretations and project them onto an entire movement advocating for basic human rights. I have never supported hate. I have never endorsed violence. To imply otherwise isn't just inaccurate, it's dangerous. His tone remained steady, but the faint tremor in his hand on the armrest revealed how hard he was working to keep control. Mehdi raised an eyebrow, his expression cold, unmoved. Dangerous? So you're saying that asking about ties to movements under international scrutiny is somehow bigotry? I'm asking questions that many are too afraid to raise in public. The energy in the studio tightened. One of the other hosts shot a nervous glance at the control room. A silence settled over the set, dense and uneasy. Zohran's patience was fraying at the edges. His lips pressed into a firm line as he chose his words with care. I'm saying, he began, his voice low but steady, there's a difference between genuine inquiry and an ambush. I agreed to this interview in good faith, to talk about real policy, about real people. Instead, you've hijacked the conversation to push your own narrative. Mehdi didn't miss a beat. Hijacked? No, Zohran. This is accountability. You've aligned yourself with causes that critics, many of them survivors, say cause them harm. When you lend your platform to that, you're not just another supporter. You're part of the machine. Zohran's lips drew into a thin line. He paused, exhaled, and when he spoke again, his voice had grown more forceful. And I'm telling you that many of those claims have been contested, debunked, or misrepresented. But that doesn't matter to you, does it? You're not here to listen. You're here to build a narrative. You want a villain for your segment, and you've decided it's me. The audience fidgeted in their seats. Some looked away, others leaned in closer, riveted by the collision unfolding in real time. Mehdi's eyes narrowed. A villain? Zohran, when people feel harmed by movements or messaging you support, it's not a spectacle to ask why. That's journalism. Journalism? Zohran echoed, his voice tinged with disbelief. He leaned forward, his face like granite. If this were journalism, you'd have shown up with context, with balance. You wouldn't have waited until I sat down to start tossing accusations like grenades. This isn't journalism, Mehdi. It's a televised prosecution. You would have come here with facts, Zohran continued, voice rising slightly, his frustration barely masked. With balanced context. You wouldn't have waited until I was seated here, live on air, to start hurling these accusations. This isn't journalism, Mehdi. It's a public trial without due process. Mehdi gave a faint, almost amused smile. Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night? That every critic is lying? That every human rights report is propaganda? That all those testimonies across years and continents are just conspiracies? The tension in the studio was now suffocating. One of the producers behind the cameras shifted anxiously. A co-host made a tentative gesture to move things along. Maybe we can circle back to this later, she offered, voice tentative. No, Mehdi cut in sharply, his tone decisive. Zohran has had nothing but favorable coverage for years. If he's going to use his elected position to champion causes that people say have caused real harm, this is exactly the moment for scrutiny. Zohran turned slightly toward the co-host, as if silently appealing for moderation, for something resembling fairness. But she looked caught between protocol and pressure, unsure whether to step in or step back. With a slow exhale, Zohran leaned back in his chair. His words came more measured, but laced with heat. Mehdi, you're entitled to your opinions, but you're not entitled to invent my motives or force me to parrot your conclusions. I came here to speak about policy, about renters, working families, and you've turned it into an ideological inquisition. That's not responsible journalism. It's deliberate provocation. Mehdi folded his arms, his expression cold and unshaken. And I think it's equally irresponsible to pretend your politics exist in a vacuum. They don't. You're not an obscure activist. You're a public official, and when you take a stance, especially one as provocative as yours, it carries consequences, real ones. Zohran's composure faltered slightly. Color had risen to his face, and his voice was tighter now. I have never supported harm. Never. I have never encouraged division or abuse, and I resent the implication that I have. Mehdi's tone dropped, his words now more precise, more surgical. Then say it, on record. Say you condemn the tactics and rhetoric that people say have led to violence or intimidation. Say it clearly. A stillness fell over the room. Even the lighting felt heavy. The studio audience sat in hushed silence, their attention locked on the face-off. Zohran looked Mehdi in the eye. He took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to steady the tremor creeping into his voice. "You're not asking a question," he said, voice steady but low. "You're demanding a confession. You want me to condemn something based on headlines and disputed claims. That's not fair. And I'm not going to do that just to satisfy your narrative." Mehdi tilted his head, voice turning ice cold. "Not fair? Do you know what's not fair? What's not fair is families being separated because someone labeled them problematic. What's not fair is activists being harassed or blacklisted because they dared to leave or to dissent. What's not fair is the silence imposed on people who spoke up and were punished for it." Zohran's jaw was tight now, his entire frame taut with restrained energy. "I'm aware of the accusations," he said deliberately, "and I'm also aware that many of those stories have been taken out of context or proven false. But you don't want the nuance. You want to cherry-pick the worst and pretend it defines everything." Mehdi fired back without missing a beat. "Zohran, the sheer number of people who've spoken out across decades and borders makes it impossible to pretend this is all context or exaggeration. You might be comfortable ignoring it. I'm not." A heavy silence hung in the air. Even the cameras seemed hesitant to zoom in. It was no longer an interview. It had become something rawer, more dangerous. A collision of ideology, image, and accountability. Then Zohran leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, tightly controlled tone. "You're not here for dialogue. You're here for an ambush. And you're hiding behind the word journalism to justify it." Mehdi's jaw tensed, his nostrils flaring ever so slightly. "I'm here for the truth. Something you seem completely unwilling to acknowledge." Zohran's composure slipped another notch. He raised his hand slightly, not accusatory, more like drawing a boundary. "No, what you're doing is using the pain of others as ammunition. You waited until the cameras were live to turn this conversation into a trial. If you'd been honest about your agenda, I never would have agreed to this appearance." The audience stirred, visibly uncomfortable. A few shifted in their seats. Others looked away, sensing they were witnessing something raw and unscripted. One of the co-hosts, her voice gentle, tried to break the spiral. "Maybe we could refocus. There's still time to discuss." "No," Mehdi said flatly, cutting her off. "If Zohran is going to use his political platform to align with movements that have drawn serious human rights criticisms, then yes, he should be challenged. That's not harassment, that's accountability." Zohran let out a short, bitter laugh. "Accountability? You haven't asked a single honest question. You have made sweeping accusations, recited headlines, and expected me to fold. That's not journalism. That's a one-sided interrogation based entirely on selective outrage." Mehdi didn't blink. "Fine," he said crisply. "Let's be specific then. Have you ever witnessed or been aware of instances where activists were pressured to cut ties with allies or organizations over political disagreement, so-called ideological purity tests?" Zohran's jaw clenched. "I'm not going to dignify that with an answer." Mehdi leaned back slowly, a grim smile forming on his lips. "You see, you can't answer because you know it happens. You've seen it. You just don't want to admit it." Zohran's expression darkened, his voice rising against his will. "Did you just call me a coward?" "If the label fits," Mehdi said calmly, locking eyes with him. For a moment, it looked like Zohran might get up and walk off the set. Instead, he closed his eyes briefly and exhaled hard, as if forcing the anger back down. "I have never been spoken to like this on live television," he said quietly. Mehdi remained unmoved. "Maybe that's because most people are too afraid to hold you accountable." Zohran's reply came instantly. "Accountable for what? For standing up to apartheid? For believing in equality? You're accusing me of thought crimes, Mehdi." Mehdi shook his head. "No, I'm holding you accountable for using your platform and political influence to lend legitimacy to movements that, for many, have caused real pain. That's not a thought crime. That's consequence. Zohran leaned forward now, his voice sharper, eyes blazing. Documented by whom? By political opponents? By op-eds with agendas? By cherry-picked quotes from years ago? Documented by human rights organizations? By court rulings? By public records? By testimony? Mehdi fired back without hesitation. Zohran's mouth opened as though to yell, but he stopped himself. He sank back slightly in his seat, visibly shaken, like even he hadn't anticipated how far this had spiraled out of control. Another host cleared her throat delicately, eyes darting between the two men. Maybe we can pivot, just briefly, back to housing policy. Our viewers— No, Mehdi said again, his tone slicing through the air. We are not going to pretend this conversation didn't happen. We owe the public some honesty. Zohran turned to him fully now, his voice trembling just slightly with strain. You're not after honesty. You're after a spectacle. You want a viral clip, Zohran said, voice cutting sharper now, and you're willing to twist anything I say to get it. Mehdi's eyes glinted with a cold clarity. I'm looking for honesty, something you seem terrified to face. Zohran's fingers curled around the edge of his chair. Honesty doesn't scare me. Malicious distortion does. You're cherry-picking the most inflammatory moments and pretending they define the whole movement. That's not truth. That's propaganda. Mehdi's smile held no warmth. I'm asking questions you don't want to answer. No, Zohran countered, his voice rising. You're throwing in accusations. You haven't asked about my actual experiences. You haven't asked what I've seen, what I believe, or what I've stood up for. You're spitting out headlines and demanding I confess to things I haven't done. Mehdi tilted his head, unmoved. All right, let's be clear. Have you ever financially supported organizations aligned with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement? Zohran exhaled hard. Of course I have. I've contributed to causes and campaigns that align with my values. Values rooted in justice. That's not a crime, Mehdi. And you don't see, Mehdi pressed, leaning forward, how that money, that visibility, that political cover enables the parts of those movements that promote division. Or worse. Zohran's voice snapped back before he could stop it. I see that you're making sweeping generalizations about thousands of activists based on the actions or statements of a few. That's not accountability. That's bigotry, whether you'll admit it or not. Mehdi's jaw tightened. Bigotry is a convenient shield when you don't want to face consequences. Zohran's voice dropped to a slow, deadly whisper. Consequences for what? My private convictions? For supporting nonviolent protest? For believing that equality shouldn't stop at borders? Mehdi's tone stayed cool, relentless. For enabling harm, Zohran, for attaching your name and influence to a cause that, for some, has had very real, very damaging consequences. The audience was stone silent now. The tension was heavy, the kind that made people afraid to even shift in their seats. Zohran's chest rose and fell, breath shallow, visibly working to stay composed. Then he spoke again, each word carved with control. You don't get to decide what I believe, and you definitely don't get to use this chair as a pulpit to dictate to millions of people how they're supposed to feel about what justice looks like. Mehdi's expression didn't soften. And you don't get to hide behind the word justice when people are being hurt in its name. Zohran looked away, jaw clenched so tightly the muscle in his cheek twitched. I'm not hiding from anything, but I won't sit here and be slandered on live TV with nothing but speculation and manufactured outrage. Mehdi straightened in his chair, unrelenting. Then prove me wrong. Say it. Say you've never seen or condoned exclusionary tactics. Say you've never stood by while others were pressured into silence or isolation because they disagreed. Zohran's eyes narrowed. I'm not going to give you the soundbite you're fishing for. Mehdi's voice dropped to a near whisper, quiet but triumphant. You can't answer, and that silence says everything. Zohran shook his head, his voice finally spiking toward a near shout. No, that's not how truth works. You don't get to whoop accusations and declare them proven because I won't play into your trap. That's not journalism, it's manipulation. Another co-host, visibly tense, tried once more. We really do need to move on. But Mehdi ignored her, voice sharper than ever. You're angry because you can't control the conversation like you control your image. Here, you don't get to hide behind PR handlers or carefully curated op-eds. Zohran stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the studio floor. His voice was icy. You know what, Mehdi? I don't have to sit here and subject myself to this. Mehdi's eyes widened, taunting. Sit down, Zohran. If you walk away now, you prove everything I've said. Zohran hesitated. His face was flushed, jaw locked in disbelief and fury. The audience held its collective breath. Zohran's hands trembled slightly at his sides as he weighed his next move. His eyes swept across the studio, at the silent cameras, the frozen audience, the other panelists sitting stiff in their seats, visibly rattled by the intensity of what was unfolding. For a moment, it looked like he might sit back down, if only to reclaim control of the narrative. But then he turned to Mehdi. The anger had cooled. What remained in his face was colder, calculated resolve. Mehdi, he said, voice steady despite the fury barely contained beneath it. You've crossed a line no responsible journalist should ever cross. You're no longer asking tough questions. You've moved beyond accountability. You are now openly attacking me for what I believe. Mehdi didn't hesitate. His response came sharp and unforgiving. I'm holding you responsible for using your platform to normalize a movement with a documented record of harm. Zohran's nostrils flared, his voice rising. Accused, not proven. You keep using the word documented like it absolves you of bias. It doesn't. Mehdi stood now too, matching Zohran's energy, eye to eye. Zohran, when dozens of people tell the same stories, when independent journalists, human rights groups, and public records all expose the same patterns, you don't get to shrug that off as bias. Zohran cut him off, his voice cracking with raw disbelief. Patterns are not convictions. You don't get to destroy someone's name over correlations and rumors. You don't get to declare guilt by association, and you certainly don't get to claim moral authority while ambushing your guest in front of a national audience. Mehdi's face flushed for the first time, his voice defensive. This isn't an ambush. This is the scrutiny that comes with being the public face of a political cause. You knew that when you stepped into this role. Zohran shook his head slowly, eyes narrowed in contempt. No, this is your crusade. This is you deciding that your outrage matters more than my humanity. Mehdi crossed his arms, jaw locked in grim defiance. And maybe your humanity is exactly what's missing here. Because if you actually cared about people, Zohran, you wouldn't be running from these questions. Zohran took a long breath, deliberate and composed. I'm not running. I'm refusing to participate in a witch hunt. There's a difference. Mehdi's voice dropped into a cold whisper, laced with disbelief. You think this is a witch hunt? Zohran's eyes locked on his. His answer was unblinking, unshaken. Yes. When you bring someone here under false pretenses, when you ignore every effort to clarify, when you reduce years of work and belief to a handful of inflammatory sound bites, you're not seeking truth. You're staging public execution. For the first time since the exchange began, Mehdi looked genuinely stunned. Lips parted slightly, words caught somewhere between reaction and reply. But before he could speak, Zohran reached for the microphone clipped to his collar. He unclasped it with slow, intentional care, each movement an act of defiance, not defeat. Don't walk out, Mehdi snapped, voice rising. If you leave, you are proving you can't defend any of it. Zohran set the mic gently on the seat he had just vacated. Then he straightened, turned, not to Mehdi, but to the audience. His voice rang out, clear and composed. I came here to talk about policy, about housing, justice, and the people I represent. I came to share something hopeful, something grounded in the real struggles of working-class New Yorkers. Instead, I was dragged into a show trial by someone more interested in spectacle than substance. Mehdi's voice cracked now, brittle, angry. Your beliefs hurt people, Zohran. That's what you still refuse to admit. Zohran turned one final time to face him, And you refuse to admit that everything you've built this moment in, your entire line of attack is rooted in allegations, not facts. You refuse to consider that the truth might be more complicated than the script you have come here to perform, Zohran said, his voice like steel. Mehdi shook his head, unmoved. The only script here is the one you've been reciting for years. Righteous indignation without responsibility. Zohran looked him dead in the eye, his expression hollow now, the warmth long gone. I won't be part of this any longer. And with that, he turned and walked off set. The cameras followed each measured step. His back was straight, his silence louder than anything he'd said. Mehdi's voice rang out behind him, raw with frustration. You owe people answers. Zohran paused just before stepping behind the curtain. He turned slightly, looking back, not at Mehdi, but toward the stunned audience. And for a fleeting moment, the fury in his eyes gave way to something quieter, sadder. No, Mehdi, he said softly, I don't owe you anything. Then he disappeared off stage. The studio remained frozen in place. No one moved. The remaining panelists stared after him, tension crackling in the silence. It felt like something irrevocable had just happened. Finally, one of the co-hosts, her voice soft and almost afraid to break the silence, whispered, We need a break. The broadcast cut to commercial. The studio lights dimmed slightly. Mehdi stood alone, arms crossed over his chest, not triumphant, but unrelenting. He didn't speak. No one did. The audience remained hushed, as if every person in the room understood they had just witnessed something that would be replayed, debated, and dissected for months, maybe years, to come. A moment when two people collided on live television, and neither one had blinked.